Is my blood that of friend or foe? Chapter 7, First Part. The carriage raced on until daybreak with Aria and Mika sleeping within. When the girl awoke, she realized the carriage had halted in the woods. It was nearly noon. Leaving the still slumbering Mika as he was, Aria decided to step outside. The door wouldn't open. The noble's lock was on it. There was no sign of Dee anywhere. When he'd gone outside, he must have locked the door. That would prevent anyone from getting inside while he was gone. She was about to give up and return to Mika's side when she heard the sound of the lock disengaging, and the door opened. Outside was Dee, and a short way off stood a boy who wore protective armor made of high polymer rubber over his clothes. To his rear were 5 or 6 lesser fire dragons. He was a dragon master, which indicated they were close to the northern frontier. Dee said there was a village called Gassam nearby. The boy was from there. On seeing Aria, he informed her that today was a festival day. Apparently it was the date when the guardian deity, also named Yassam, had descended to Earth and told the founders to build a village there. Now that the boy mentioned it, she noticed the sound of what might have been firecrackers in the distance. Looking back at the carriage, Aria said, "Mika will be overjoyed. Let's take at least one day off. Give a thought to your traveling companions for once." "Please do," the youthful dragon master said, grinning with pleasure. His blue eyes reflected Aria. "My family runs an inn." Behind the boy, the fire dragons blew 15 feet of flames in unison. The reason for that display was unclear. Yassam was a miniature garden of a village that looked as though it might be swallowed up at any moment by the clear blue sky. Its population couldn't have exceeded 100. Strings of firecrackers draping down narrow streets and across the roofs of houses exploded into flame, one after another. People wearing masks and costumes representing dragons, one-eyed beasts, armored serpents, and deities of all shapes paraded down the street. And old men who had drunk their fill of the wine, spilling from a portable shrine, slumped all around. Mika's eyes were alight and his upper body swayed to the tune of what were most likely folk songs drifting from unseen speakers. On the west end of the square stood the establishment run by the boy, Al, and his family, the Bumper Crop Inn. After that she wouldn't hear any more the boy had to say, and he started crying before crumpling on his bed at last. Success, she thought. But just then Al came in and invited her to go to the festival with him. Inside, Aria was cursing and grinding her teeth, but she resigned herself to it and said, "Sure. Is it okay if the boy comes with us too?" Disappointment showed on Al's face, but he didn't say so. Aria decided not to ask for Dee's permission. Clearly it wouldn't be forthcoming. She thought it'd be fine as long as they came back fairly soon. However, she had no firm idea of what would constitute fairly soon. "They're heading out," the hoarse voice said. Dee headed for the door. He could hear the voices in the next room as if the wall wasn't even there. His right hand took hold of the doorknob, and at the same time his whole body turned to the right. Swaying in the floor, at Dee's feet, with a cold twang, was a silver arrow. Did it come from someone else sent by their foes? The sword that never left his side was drawn, glittering as it waited for its next victim. "Outside the window," his left hand informed him, but Dee ignored that and turned back toward the door. 5 seconds passed. 10. There was a knock at the door. Just as it burst open, Dee thrust the tip of his blade against the chest of his visitor. "Inhospitable as ever, and after all the love I have for you." Showing him a quick grin before glancing down at the sword against her throat, was a fairly young woman sheathed in black protective gear, with quivers on her back and knee, and a lowered bow in her right hand. "Remember me, it's Gianna." "You the one who saved the boy?" His question, which avoided her own and showed not the least interest in her actions or situation, led the actress to look somewhat disappointed as she answered in the affirmative. "And I provided the girl with backup when she was battling Abby Dozen too. But during the fight the driver shot me in the shoulder, taking me out of the action. And judging from the way you folks are strolling around the village in broad daylight without a care in the world, I take it Abby Dozen's being put down. Who are you working for now?" "That's top secret. Are you ready to lop off both my arms to get out of it?" "That's top secret. Are you ready to lop both my arms off to get it out of me?" As she jokingly gazed at Dee, the color suddenly drained from her countenance. "That was a joke. I'm just kidding." She barely managed something resembling a smile, but a drop of sweat fell from her suddenly pale face, and the question remained unanswered. "It's Count Langland." "If you'd like to tell me about it," the hunter said, "stay where you are." Apparently these two were meeting for the first time in a long time, yet Dee almost seemed to push the rooted girl aside as he stepped out into the hall. "Don't!" Gianna shouted. "Outside it's Kraken's territorial waters." Of course, the Grim Reaper himself could have been out there, and it still wouldn't have halted the figure in black. Patrick. The sweets vendor had been set up right next to the inn, and Aria brought 3 bunches of cotton candy on sticks and handed 2 to the boys. Miko was absolutely delighted, taking the fluffy candy in hand and mashing it into a small wad that he bit into as if it were a dinner roll. A black and white image of Gianna by Yoshitaka Amano. That's an odd way of eating it. That's an odd way of eating it you have, the huntress said. No, that's the way a man eats it. Al replied, and he did the same. With Al at the fore, the trio walked toward the town square. Usually an image of the village's patron deity, the focus of the festival would be set up in the square to receive offerings of prayer day and night. A number of roads led to the square. They were lined with handmade stands run by villagers, as well as rows of stalls set up by the wandering mountebanks. Such festivals drew like a magnet. Beneath the rough canvas awnings, arrays of garishly colorful treats and toys, and that would make any child's eyes sparkle, awaited their pint-sized patrons. Aria noticed that as they got closer to the square, Al couldn't stop looking all around them. "What's the matter?" "It's just that I don't see any of the lookouts." Festivals drew trouble. Quarrels between villagers were bad enough, but when outsiders with questionable intentions were added to the mix, you ended up with more burglars entering empty homes, or women and children being abducted than anyone could ever count. To guard against such occurrences, lookouts were posted. Armed volunteers from the village who would split into a few groups and either keep watch in an assigned place or go out on patrol. Though each street should have had at least 2 men on it, Al hadn't seen any. They were just at the end of the street and the entrance to the square. Walk another 20 yards and they'd see the little golden shrine surrounded by throngs of villagers. The sky was clear, and the cheery annual bustle continued to the accompaniment of firecrackers, sunshine, and voices raised in song. "We're going back, Meeker." The boy was amazed to hear that, seemingly out of the blue. Still, he didn't make any objection because of the strain and deadly intent Aria's voice carried. Al asked her quite innocently what was wrong. "Are there any lookouts?" Looking around, Al let a curious escape. As he did, Aria took Meeker's hand and began jogging back the way they'd come. "Hey, what's wrong?" Meeker asked, going with her but not knowing why. "I don't know. We shouldn't have gone outside." As Aria spoke, a small spot on her back grew hot. Her blade shot out on reflex, and the dart it bisected fell to the ground. Shocked, the people around her either froze in their tracks or gave Aria odd looks as they passed her. Most likely all they'd seen was that the girl who'd been walking along normally, in 1 second had suddenly changed, and was standing there now with a sword in hand. Aria's speed was so great, it looked like a jump cut in a film. There was a round of applause. Aria turned and looked behind her. On the opposite side of the street, a dark booth had been set up. Since the street was narrow, the 10-foot-deep booth extended down a little alley perpendicular to the street. And the booth was just about wide enough to allow 2 adults or 3 children to line up and throw at the same time. At a range of 10 feet, even adults would have a hard time hitting the center of the circular targets. A man of average height and build in a hunting cap stood in front of the booth, which surprisingly enough was devoid of patrons. There was a red towel draped around his neck. Aria's eyes caught the gleam of darts between the fingers of his right hand. "What the hell was that all about?" The 40-ish man grinned and replied, "Well, you just looked like you were out for blood, so I couldn't help but take a poke at you. And just as I suspected, you're damn good. Just about shriveled my balls." "Thanks. So what do I owe you for the dart? Don't sweat it. See you around." Before the man had even finished speaking, Aria started to walk away again, and her blood froze. She was no longer holding Meeker's hand. She'd let go of... No, don't cry. At the instant she cut down the dart. Before she could call out the boy's name, she heard a familiar voice say, "Aria." Al was standing in an alley directly across from the dart booth, beckoning to her. "The kid went that way," he said, pointing down the alley. Thank heaven for small favors. Maria thought as she charged forward. When she looked over her shoulder, she saw Al following. To her left was the side of someone's house, while to her right were some woods. "You can't come with me," she told the young man. "Why not? Up ahead's the swamp. You're safer having me along." "No," she told him, but he came along anyway. Maria hadn't yet noticed the flames of affection that burned in the boy's eyes. Suddenly she thought, if only Dee were here. First part end. Second part. The hunter left his room, or he thought he did, but he found himself back inside it. The window was now in front of him. It seemed as if he just charged in through the door. Dee turned around. Gianna was in the doorway. "It's a fold-in space," the hoarse voice said, sounding intrigued. "My, you're still tied to him, left hand. How tenacious of you. Mind if I come in? Oh, just for your information, cutting me down won't get you out of the fold, so let's have a little talk." Dee raised his left hand. Gianna let the tension drain from her body. She was relieved that Dee hadn't drawn his longsword. "Could it be that you're playing nice because I saved those other two?" "You've got 3 minutes before you have to leave." After Dee spoke, his right hand flashed into action. All Gianna saw was a momentary gleam. She hadn't been able to move a muscle. She couldn't even begin to guess what had occurred. Finally she crowded in shock. "You were out for my blood," and backed away. Though she knew full well what Dee was capable of, she still couldn't believe her own carotid artery had been cut. She touched it to see. The wound had already closed. Not only that, but it didn't even hurt. Acting as if nothing had transpired, Dee put the blade of his sword against the palm of his left hand. The steel was wet and red, with blood from Gianna's artery. He immediately brought the blade away again. All the blood had been wiped from it. "Tell me about the connection between Langland and Kraken," Dee said before going over to a small table beside the bed. On it sat a ceramic pitcher full of water in a cup. He put the lip of the pitcher against his hand. With the slightest of surps, the pitcher was sucked into the palm of the hunter's left hand. There was the sound of chewing. The pitcher was fired clay. That made water and earth. Gianna began to speak by asking, "Do you believe nobles can be conscious of their crimes?" There was no reply. That was Dee. Gianna went on. "Langland was one of the few in the nobility who possessed a conscience. That girl, Aria, was it? Well, he has long regretted the fact that they attacked her home, slew her parents, and abducted her siblings." Between the sounds of crunching and chewing, the hoarse voice grumbled something about it being a little too late for that. When they learned that the girl they'd bitten and left behind had become a hunter and was out to get them, he alone was delighted. At that point, his compatriots had a half-serious meeting about how to stave off her attack, and he was the only one who failed to attend. Not only that, but he hired me, and others, to secretly keep her and her friends safe. There were others. 5 all told. Did you think the girl had slain all those nobles on her own? Most were actually slain by her guardians. For just a moment a faraway look came into her eye. "I'm not sure whether or not you'll believe me, but Langland is prepared to let the girl destroy him. That's why he defied his father-in-law and had us protect the girl." "Father-in-law? Didn't you know? Langland's wife was Kraken's only daughter. Of course, 250 or 60 years ago, she was destroyed. Not by you, but by some other hunter. Ever since, Langland has been a confirmed bachelor." "That's one messed up noble," the hoarse voice remarked. "No, I only happened to glimpse it by chance, but he has a photo of a human girl on display in his private quarters. A beautiful lass of 17, maybe 18. There was no name written on it. Was Kraken aware of his son-in-law's meddling?" "Vaguely. If he had any real evidence, I suppose he'd have done away with Langland by now." "If Langland wants Aria to attack him, why is he trying to stop me?" "Because you're in the way," Gianna stated brazenly. Page break. Less than 10 minutes later, Aria and Al were at the edge of an ancient swamp where the air was heavy with a miasma that distorted the sunlight and stands of trees. And the place was the very embodiment of decay. The only saving grace was that they could still hear music playing at the festival. Just beneath the surface of the black water, algae moved. "Fall in here and there's no saving you," Al said, surveying their surroundings with distaste in his eyes. "Did the kid walk off alone?" "Nope, he had odd." "Did the kid walk off alone?" "Nope. He had a tall, thin guy with him. It wasn't anyone from the village." "Who was he, Meeker?" The huntress had cupped one hand beside her mouth and shouted the boy's name, but Al grabbed her elbow roughly and tugged on it. "What?" There, he said, pointing into the swamp. Sure enough, the boy stood in the center of it. The water only came up to his ankles. It was almost as if someone were underwater holding him up, or... Maria turned to Al and said, "Go home. Or if you don't want to do that, at least find someplace safe. And no matter what happens, don't leave that spot." Not waiting for him to reply, she called out into the swamp, "Meeker, come back this way." Her reply came from down at Meeker's feet. Maria's eyes widened. She just noticed that on the water's surface, Meeker's reflection stood side by side with that of someone else. A tall, thin man. "That's him," Al yelled from a spot 15 or 20 feet away. His eyes, too, were trained on the man reflected in the water's surface. Indeed, the man was standing to Meeker's right. It was reflected in the water, and yet there was no one next to the real Meeker. And the man smirked. "If you want this kid back, come into the water in his place." And the voice came from the water's surface. "Don't do it," Al said in a firm tone. Maria made her decision quickly. Her foe could manipulate water. She knew as long as she remained on land, he couldn't hope to win. "Okay," she told the man in the water, "but in return you have to let the kid go right away." "Fine with me. I think it's only fair to tell you I can't swim. Not to worry. All you have to do is look at me and keep walking. Let the kid go first, otherwise I'm not going anywhere." And the man nodded, giving a push to the back of the Meeker reflected in the water. Apparently the boy must have been through a terrifying experience, because he didn't say a word. Showing no happiness at escaping his abductor, the boy silently walked across the water's surface. And with a plop, the huntress's foot sank up to the ankle, but there it stopped. Her footing was unsteady, but she'd get through this somehow. Planting one foot after another, she managed to maintain her balance as she proceeded in the direction dictated by the man reflected on the water's surface. Her progress was intentionally slow, so that Meeker would have time to get back on dry land. If she reached the man first, he might take Meeker prisoner again, and this would all be for naught. Every time one of them took a step, ripples spread across the water's surface, distorting the man's face. The two passed each other when Maria had gone a third of the way. "Go straight back to D," she told him in a low voice, in the boy's face. A mask that didn't even register fear bobbed up and down. When the hunters had gone 2/3 of the way, she heard Al call out, "He made it." She was glad he'd insisted on coming along, and wanted to shake his hand. Now she needn't hold back any longer. She'd find her foe's weakness and run him through. And there was no hesitation in Maria's heart. Once her feet had almost reached the man's face, he ordered her to stop. "I believe that the boy is standing on dry land," said the man reflected in the water's surface. It looked for all the world like he was just a reflection there, not underwater. "Well then, stand right beside me. Once you do, you'll soon be just like me. Traveling through the water, we'll reach Vigand Kraken's castle in no time." "That'll happen," Maria murmured in her heart of hearts. "In your dreams." Drawing her long sword with that cry, she drove it through the man's heart. It was exactly like stabbing into water. And the instant Maria realized that, her body was enveloped by a great splash. Holding her breath, she madly tried to rise to the surface, but couldn't. The man was above her. Was he on the water's surface or in the water? At any rate, he was holding Maria's head down with both hands. On closer inspection, there was no dimensionality to the man at all. Just as before, he was an image reflected in the water's surface. Nevertheless, Maria found it impossible to break through him and reach the surface. And though she thrust her long sword at him, the result was the same. When she tried to move away, the man's image mirrored her movements. He stuck with her. "You won't die. I'll transform you once you've passed out." The man's voice echoed through Maria's head, which felt like it would explode just as she was running out of breath. And the last air left her lungs. And black water rushed into them. She would have choked violently, but that would have required her to be able to breathe. Her vision grew dark. Suddenly her head broke the surface. Even before she was aware of the heat, she was coughing half to death as she bobbed and sank over and over again. "Come this way." It was Al. He stood at the water's edge, beckoning to the huntress. She spied a pair of fire dragons by his right side. How did the boy summon them? She had to wonder. Judging from the heat, she knew the dragons had released their flames, and there was still water in her lungs. Giving up on her question, Maria began feverishly clawing her way through the water. Something caught hold of her foot. She turned around, and the man was on the water's surface. It wasn't his weird appearance that held Maria's attention, or rather the burn marks that clearly. "Go with him," I'll remain in exactly the same pose. Let's get going. Taking the two boys by the hand, Aria was leading them toward the village square when she heard something knifing through the air. Second part end. Third part. Arriving in the square, Dee and Gianna collided with the throng. Desperate cries intermingled there. Carry him to Dr. Torres. No, he's past saving now. Pushing his way through the mob, Dee saw Al lying at its center. Darts impaled his heart and throat. It was clear at a glance that he'd received fatal injuries. What happened? Dee asked a nearby farmer. Damned if I know. Just now he fell to the ground as soon as he stepped from that alley. What's back that way? The swamp. Nothing but that. To Dee's rear, Gianna gasped. She said, "The waters are Kraken's domain, but," she drew a breath, "this dirt belongs to Don J. Aside from me, he's the only one left of those Langland hired. If he's here." The utterance stiffened, and it wasn't just her. The surrounding villagers froze as well. The young man in black stood at the focus of a dead gaze. "It's just a coincidence, all of us. We were working independently. You have to believe me." The mysterious tableau Gianna had witnessed a short time earlier flashed into her brain like lightning. As the left hand that had consumed the entire ceramic pitcher told Dee that water and earth should be enough, the hunter's sword had flashed out, and Langland's fold in space, something a nuclear weapon wouldn't be able to scratch, had been broken. What was this gorgeous young man? For the first time, Gianna had felt true fear. However, now the superhuman killing lust had vanished, and he pressed his left hand to the boy's bloodied throat. The boy had already breathed his last, but then with the murderous implement still stuck in him, Al squeezed out a faint thread of a voice. The villagers pulled back like a sudden fleeing tide. The dart guy, from the festival, suddenly showed up. Said something about taking Aria and the kid to Langland's castle. Dee stood up. As soon as the hunter's left hand came away, Al went to his final reward. On seeing how the young man of unearthly beauty put gleaming coins in the boy's mouth in keeping with frontier tradition, the villagers were stunned. Those $5,000 coins were worth about the same as the village's annual budget. Give him the best funeral the village can offer. What's left goes to his family. No one needed to be warned against trying to pocket the money. Dee turned to Gianna. "Going to kill me, too?" The whole village froze. "Please." That was all Gianna could manage by way of a reply, and it took her 11 seconds to muster that much. "Show me the way to Langland's castle." Gianna could only nod her consent to Dee's demand. The whole reason Gianna had called on Dee was to inform him of Count Langland's intentions and get him to stop Aria's travels. Before Langland let Aria exact her revenge on him, he wanted to solve the riddle of why she remained physically human despite having been bitten. Toward that end, Aria alone was to be led back to his castle. Dee was in the way, and Gianna had orders to get rid of him, and now they were riding their cyborg horses night and day. In a 5-day trip to Langland's castle, and she was staring at Dee's profile. From the very start, she'd known it was no use. 2 years earlier, as a newly trained archer, Gianna had been pursuing a group of 5 outlaws when she fell into their trap and was brought to the brink of death. Just as the pitch-black nothingness was about to swallow her up, Dee had come rushing in and laid waste to them. The keenness of his swordplay, along with his good looks, was enough to drive Gianna into rapture. She'd certainly been disappointed to learn that Dee had been pursuing the same outlaws. When she'd first entered the nobleman's employ, she hadn't known the huntress had traveling companions. However, on learning that it was Dee that accompanied her, Gianna had given up the fight. Only partly because she was in his debt. Ever since she'd burned as a woman, now as a human being. In Gianna's eyes, Dee was an object of adoration surpassing the ideal man, a being who would allow her to maintain her purity. What in the... Far in the distance, a purplish light was rising from the desolate plain, at supersonic speed. 1,000, 1,500, 2,000. The afternoon sky was clear. When the light burst, the heavens darkened. Rain clouds. But they weren't hanging over Dee and Gianna. "Roughly 30 miles ahead of us," the hoarse voice said. "Someone shot off a rain shell, and Kraken favors the water." Page break. The man, Don J., had taken great pains to avoid the water. It was the source of the opposition's power. It existed everywhere. Though he had faith in the implements his employer had provided, the enemy was simply too powerful. Don J. also saw the point of light. Oh shit, he thought, because it had been fired from somewhere terribly close by, and the instant those dark clouds spread overhead, rain began to pound down like a waterfall. However, he had no choice but to keep going. The man advanced his wagon and its two-horse team beneath the dark clouds. Ray had been injected with a hypnotic drug. Meeker seemed to have his soul sucked out to begin with, and both of them lay in the cargo bed behind him. He'd had the foresight to purchase the wagon from a farmer in advance. The rain intensified, and the horses and wagon seemed to give off white smoke. Don J was already soaked to the skin, and the rain was bad enough, but water from the wagon wheel splashed him from head to toe, forcing him to hold his breath. To the east, it's all swamps and lakes. Can't go that way, not even by accident. The fight hadn't gone out of Don J's eyes. Suddenly the horses changed direction, and they turned left, onto the road east. Idiots! Where do you think you're going? Though he madly tugged on the reins and cracked the whip, the horses wouldn't halt their crazed gallop in the one direction they weren't supposed to go in, almost as if they were receiving orders from some other, more capable driver. What gives? Oh! Would you stop already? Shifting his gaze from the backs of the horses to their hooves, Don J widened his eyes. The damp black earth held a reflection of the horse's legs in the driver's seat. He also made out a man cracking a whip. Too shocked for words, Don J fearfully turned his eyes to the right. There was no one there. And there was no one way there could be. Yet he looked down again. There was a man. Wasn't he? Covered in bandages and sitting to Don's right, working that whip. Don J lashed with the whip like a man possessed. The bandaged man struck as well. There was Don J's whip that actually struck them. In his reflection in the water, he had no whip in his hands, and the bandaged figure's whip alone controlled the horses. Rain surrounded him, driving rain, and wasn't the water Viscount Kraken's world. It was unclear just how much time had passed, but the world was sealed in darkness. While only the pounding of iron-shod hooves defied the sound of the rain, but they stopped unexpectedly. Taking a repeating rifle from the weapon locker under the driver's seat, Don J braced the weapon against his shoulder. Come on, I'm just waiting for you. His shouts were instantly obliterated by the rain. But look, not 30 feet ahead of the wagon, an unmistakably human figure had taken shape. The instant Don J was sure it was a man wrapped from head to toe in bandages, he pulled the trigger on his rifle. And the force of the large-bore rifle was evident in the way the nearly 12-pound weapon kicked. The bandaged figure's head was blown to bits. Just like the rain, they were clear water. From the neck down, the figure had collapsed, clothes and all. Did that finish him? Don J said to himself, thinking he had eternal mystery on his hands. Nope. The voice came from down at his feet. Looking down reflexively, Don J saw on the water's surface the figure in bandages sitting in the driver's seat. S.O.B., you son of a... Standing up and quickly firing a shot into the mysterious form. All he saw was a splash of water. And once it was gone, the bandaged figure was in the driver's seat again. You son of a... Don J shouted. So whipped up, all he could do was adjust his rifle. That same rifle was wrenched from his grip by a hand that had suddenly reached around from behind him. What are you? Was what Don J saw real, or was it some dream reflected in the falling rain? Grinning by Don J's right side, the bandaged figure pulled the trigger of the gun now leveled by his hip. Taking the kind of massive 60 caliber round that would pierce a fire dragon's armor to the center of his chest, Don J was blown 15 feet from the driver's seat, sending up a great splash as he hit the black ground. Lowering the rifle, the bandaged figure let out a low laugh. The water was Viscount Kraken's domain. As soon as you were soaked in the rain, this fight was as good as over. He turned to the bed of the wagon. We may need the woman, but the broad's of no further use. Here's where you buy it. Not hesitating in the least, he turned the cruel barrel of the weapon on Meeker. The bandaged finger around the rifle's trigger gave a strong squeeze. A heartbeat later, there was an explosive flash. Chapter 7